So we are gathered today to commemorate the centenary of the Great War, 1914 to 1918, to commemorate the sacrifices and honor the memory of those who gave their lives and their emotional energies, their psychological well-being, their physical resources, and so on, and to consider those various legacies, what has come down to us in the last 100 years. Today's session will be moderated by Stewart Anderson, who is a professor in the history program, and he is joined by Kenneth Hartvigsen, who is a curator at the Museum of Art, and Jarica, who is in the English department. If you aren't familiar with the format, we are simulating a cafe experience, and you have three impassioned intellectuals who are discussing the legacy of the Great War, and we are eavesdropping on this conversation. So they just happen to have, I think, a few visuals at their disposal in the cafe, and maybe referring to those. And we'll just allow that conversation to continue until about 10 to 5. At 10 to 5, we will invite members of the audience to come over to the microphone, which is here by the map, and would ask, if you do come up and ask a question, that you state your name, even if it's just your first name, and your major of study or the program that you represent if you're faculty, so that we can get a sense of your position and perspective. So I will give the remainder of the time to our panel.
Okay. So we're here to talk about the legacy of the war, which is kind of hard to just jump right into. You want to talk a little bit about the war, right? It's so pivotal, it's so seminal. Jarica studies, among other authors, Joseph Conrad. So I want to start today with a quote that Joseph Conrad wrote in an article called The Shock of War from 1919. He said, "The first days of the third week in July, while the telegraph wires hummed with words of enormous import, which were to fill blue books, yellow books, white books, and to arouse the wonder of mankind, passed for us in light-hearted preparations for the journey. But was it but just a rush through Germany to get across as quick as possible?" While he's writing in 1919, I think it's pretty clear that the memory of 1914 is really powerfully present in this passage. And anyone who's ever taken a class on World War I obviously knows that everyone thought they'd be home by Christmas, right? This is almost a commonplace, almost a truism now, whether it's really the case or not among the general public. What I'd like to know, though, is whether you think artists and authors felt the same way in 1914, and do they look back on it the same way after 1918?
I'll start talking about the authors. So I think there tends to be a sense that literary modernism arose kind of in conjunction with World War I, that it was such a dramatic and violent and turbulent time that there was no other way to kind of reconcile it other than to come up with new literary forms that were highly experimental in order to capture the voice and to capture the changes that were happening in consciousness and the mechanization and changes in relationship to nature and relationships with time. And while I understand that inclination, and yes, we can say that the war kind of marked an abrupt change in the literature, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that many of these ideas were already starting to kind of percolate in the literature. Conrad's actually a great example. Some of his earlier, or not earlier, but some of his texts between 1900 and 1910 are already playing with form in very interesting ways. Both Lord Jim, Lord Jim's probably the greatest example. He's incorporating what Virginia Woolf talks about much later in modern fiction when she says, look, we need to kind of capture these falling atoms that kind of represent consciousness, that she says life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. So we need to start looking at the mind, and we need to start looking at different modes of representing interiority. And Conrad, as you pointed out, is kind of already doing that pre-war. So the forms did change. They became much darker, and as I mentioned, much more mechanized. Eliot's The Wasteland is a great example of this. It begins with April is the cruelest month. He turns against nature. Woolf does this in Mrs. Dalloway as well. Nature is dramatic in the time passes section. Things are just changing. But they were already changing pre-war too. So I know that's not a direct way of answering your question, but I think it's both and. I think that the literary experimentation was already put into effect, and the war certainly heightened some of those concerns.
Yeah, I think you could definitely say the same of artists. If you look at art that's existing both in a European context and an American context before the war, you're seeing a turn towards more modernist, what we would think of now as modernist aesthetics. You're thinking about people looking towards advertisement and sort of mass imagery or use of newspapers, sort of found objects, those kind of materials that are sort of flattening the worldview instead of this kind of illusionistic representational view of the world. But I also think that there's no question that the abrupt reaction to the war, the kind of rupture that occurs in the art world, is really dramatic. When you look at, say the emergence of Dadaism, which is really rejecting art. We have a generation of artists who are saying maybe we were complicit in this cultural march towards war, and maybe it's time to tear down everything, to just completely start from rubble and see if there's something worth salvaging within this thing that we call art or this thing we call culture. So I agree with you. I think that there are artists who are already experimenting, already fracturing the view. I mean, if you think of the Cubists fracturing the view, or think of American artists who are looking to like I said, signage and mass-produced packaging from commodities and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think by the time we're a couple of years into the war, there's a recognition that this is not ending quickly. This is not going away, and we have to grapple with this now. That this is our new reality, it seems to me. And so the reaction that artists have to that is, well, if this is our new reality, I'm going to wholly reject it. I'm going to completely start from new and just tear everything to pieces.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the more more popular themes we associate with World War I is the idea of trauma, from shell shock to the kind of cinema we see in the 1920s, and in literature and art as well. Would you say that, given that modernism already existed, and a lot of the things that are going on in World War I are simply being, maybe there's a rupture, a little bit of a change, but there's a lot of continuity. Would you say that the idea of trauma is accelerated or accentuated by modernism? If so, how?
So I'm working on a project right now on fear, and my argument is essentially that the very nature of fear changed with World War I, and I don't think that it's divorced from trauma. Essentially what I'm finding is that Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, has a text that he's writing on submarines, on what he views as a submarine attack. And it's pre-war, and it's pre-sinking of the Lusitania. Joseph Conrad also has a submarine story, The Tale, written middle of the war, post-Lusitania. And essentially what I see is that there's something very different about the trauma of the war experience. And I think kind of the central nugget to it is this inability to know from where the danger is actually coming. So we have to remember that World War I is the first mechanized war. So we now have airplanes in the sky, we have gas attacks, and we have submarines. And all of this is very different from sort of like a forward march in the Napoleonic War, where you have like your bayonet and it's like one-on-one. There's a power in that. I think there's a powerlessness and hence a trauma that comes from sitting in a trench, essentially waiting, but not knowing from where the attack is actually going to come, or if you're going to be, chosen, as it were, right? It becomes a game of chance. So I think that the trauma that we see in World War I is brought about specifically because of the mechanization, because of the changes in the type of warfare, but also in the fact that the threat is almost unidentifiable and indiscernible. Siegfried Sassoon has this great poem where he talks about the threat of fear, and that even just the sound of kind of the shrieking bombs is enough in some cases to just send soldiers to their death, just because it's kind of this lived aspect of fear, but they can't locate it. And so I think when we're talking trauma studies, or we're talking PTSD and everything that kind of has come out of the war, I think much of it has to do with an unidentifiable or unlocatable threat. And I think it's a very different experience.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of maybe sort of post-war art coming out of the European experience. You think of, say, the Surrealists, and with their work being so nightmarish, so much about juxtapositions of bizarre figures and forms, and a clear kind of logical pathway that you might be able to follow through a conventional painting or a painting from an earlier era is simply missing. There's really no way for you to navigate that space comfortably. As you said, it's kind of violent imagery, melancholia, a feeling of the uncertain, the unknown, that really permeates the European art experience if you're thinking about sort of the Dadaists moving into the surreal artists. I think American art is quite different. I think American, for a long time, the sort of the standard that was taught was that World War I didn't really have an effect on American artists. That's been taught really since the 60s. I was taught that by certain professors in graduate school, that just, the war had a huge impact on European artists, but maybe not so much on American artists. Now we're starting to revise that picture, but I think it's clear to say that the impact was very different. And that if we look at, say, the images, the sort of visual culture produced during the war, which of course has occupied me with my World War I poster show that I recently opened at the museum, the visual culture that America is producing during the war, I would say, is maybe largely one of avoidance. That there is a threat, that perhaps exists in some of the imagery, but the reality of what that threat means is kind of subverted, and I think maybe we didn't want to deal with the reality. It was looming, everyone was aware of it, but there is a feeling that at least in the visual culture we're trying to get away from it somehow.
I think this does change a little bit, though, with propaganda posters.
Yeah.
Because
it's a very different kind of imagery than, say,
yeah, or even just the submarine. Even the submarine, the Lusitania. So in America, that'd be great.
Let's look at some of the.
Can I move
some of
this?
these right now.
Oh, excellent. Here we go.
So when America entered the war, one of the big posters just featured the language, "Remember the Lusitania," because this is the first time we were dealing with unrestricted submarine warfare. The Lusitania was kind of this ambiguous vessel. Like, was it actually a war vessel? Was it carrying munitions? Was it not? Was it a neutral? Was it not? And so I think an event like that, I mean, clearly it compelled America to enter the war.
But it takes a long time. That's
a long time. But I don't think there can be complete avoidance.
Yeah,
I
agree.
I do think there was, at least in their use of that image in the poster, there is an understanding that this is changing.
That's really interesting, I think, actually, because we often think of a propaganda poster wanting to get excited for the war. There's so many examples we show our students, right?
Yeah.
And yet some of the posters might reflect, whether consciously or not, some of these fears you're mentioning, the unknowable mechanistic death,
Right.
Yeah.
right, which is later given a better expression in films like All Quiet on the Western Front, but maybe echoes of that are already forming even in official propaganda.
Well, I mean, perfect example is this one that you see on the screen here is a British poster, which doesn't say "Remember the Lusitania," but that's clearly what we're doing here. I know it's kind of hard to read, so I'll help you out. In the middle we have a Navy officer, and they're helping men, women, and children into the boat, so it's clear they're civilians who have been impacted here. And they're pointing into the background. This right here is a German U-boat that is surfacing, and this is a ship behind that is about to go under the waves. Now, so this is a wonderful British kind of Remember the Lusitania poster. For contrast, here's a German poster. These are all up at the MOA for you to see right now. And we have German officers pointing at the same thing, a boat sinking on the horizon, but the slogan is, "Your money helps keep us safe. Your money buys U-boats that keeps munitions away from us and saves our lives." So we have the German and the British sides showing a very different view of the same thing. And here's an American poster just for fun that you've probably all seen before of an American Navy officer riding a missile through the waves. I was very careful in writing my wall text for this in our museum exhibition, as you can imagine. But, so I think this is a good example of what you're talking about, that there's clearly an awareness of the idea of the naval warfare. There's an awareness of the fact that we thought the ocean was going to keep us safe, but then it turns out to be that the ocean is actually what pulls us into the war, that actually the ocean is not a barrier around us, but is the thoroughfare through which war will be conducted. But here we have this American who's a cowboy riding the bucking bronco of the missile, so he'll be able to handle that threat, right? So there's an acknowledgement, but I think also a kind of rah-rah avoidance that happens in American posters.
The thing I like about this is, so just in terms of the numbers of the Lusitania, there were 2,000 passengers on board, 1,200 perished, 900 bodies were never recovered. But just as Britain was sort of crying foul on Germany, right, that you attacked a passenger liner, Germany flipped it around on Britain and said, look, you weren't a neutral ship, you were carrying ammunition.
Munitions, yeah.
And in that sense, we had declared war. We had declared unrestricted submarine warfare.
Absolutely.
It was fair game. I think you see that in the posters.
I mean, that's the thing. This German poster, which we have next to the British one in the museum, so you can see them side by side, where they're saying your money buys U-boats that's keeping these munitions from our shores. That's true.
Yeah.
This isn't really. I mean, obviously they're spinning it and they're putting it in a certain context to encourage more people to donate. But this is truthful. Your money is buying U-boats, and we're using that U-boats to keep munitions from harming our soldiers and from coming to our shore, including by sinking ships like the Lusitania. So they're making the German argument for why we should be able to sink ships like this.
Yeah, that's great.
This conversation about technology on the one hand and nature, we're talking about this, the ocean is going to protect us, right? That's interesting to me too. In your opinion, how does societies or cultures, I guess, conception of nature change after World War I?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that, at least from an American perspective, that so much of the rhetoric leading up to the war, if you're not talking about the preparedness movement, if you're talking about sort of the dominant rhetoric leading up to the war, is that this is not our war. This is a European war, and that presupposes that geography is again going to act as a barrier keeping American lives safe from these things that are occurring. And the biggest geographical barrier would be the ocean, right? So by the time that we get into the war and we do see posters like the soldier writing, the naval officer writing, emphasizing the experience in the water, or even posters that show horrifying monstrous Huns, which is of course the propaganda term to use to talk about German soldiers, a monstrous Hun that we would think of as almost like Godzilla size, who's peering across the Atlantic Ocean at us. And we see bloody hands and a bloody bayonet, and he's looking up over the horizon. A Hun of that size can step across the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean is no longer a barrier. So I think that there's no question that, at least in the propaganda, they start to immediately deal with that issue. But I also think that that's something that the kind of shrinking of the world is something that continues to happen in American art, where there is such a kind of Atlantic art experience that grows out of the post-war era, where there are American expatriate artists and musicians and writers who are living in Paris for long periods of time, and then they maybe come back and bring some of that artistic style with them, or we have European artists who are fleeing because of the war and coming to the United States. So I think it becomes very clear from a political propaganda and from a cultural point of view that the world is much smaller than we had imagined it was before this war started.
That's really interesting. I think the experience on the British front is fundamentally different. It would have to be, because this was a war that was fought on their soil, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the war poets are probably kind of the best example of the use of nature. I talked about T.S. Eliot a little bit earlier, and Virginia Woolf, both of whom have nature kind of turn against humanity in their works. Eliot has an image in The Wasteland where the corpses are actually fertile, they're actually fertilizer. And you think about that, right? You think about the number of soldiers that were lost in, say, the Battle of the Somme, for example, right? And without being too graphic, these are burial grounds, and kind of the ways that the human body is actually kind of providing nutrients for the soil.
Or poppies.
So, exactly, poppies. Yeah. And so Eliot plays with that image a lot. And again, for Woolf, nature is much more hostile. But I do think in the war poets, you start to see a very clear divide between early war poetry and later war poetry. Early war poetry relies on kind of more romantic images of nature as pastoral. You have the sense that if I die, think only this of me, right? That I've given kind of my life for my country. And toward the end, again, mechanization is probably the best term I can come up with. And you do see kind of a rebellion of the landscape. So again, I think it's just a very different conversation on the British front. Anybody who's ever traveled to England knows you can't go into any little town without seeing monuments of war dead, and or buildings that were bombed. I mean, this is like central London, right? You can't escape it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a fundamentally different story.
Yeah, and I think again that leads to the fact that the party line has been that American art didn't react as strongly to the war, because if you think about the art that's being produced in Europe in the 1930s, and we think about surrealism, when we think about these complicated sort of dream nighttime type images, which clearly can be reacting directly to trauma. And then we look at what's happening in the United States in the 1930s, and we think about maybe the American regionalists, who are really celebrating this kind of fertile American landscape, which, as you say, was not scarred during the war. And so there seems to be a celebration of that. Now, I think a fairer thing would be to read all of that within the context of this post-war moment and say, this is a celebration of an American landscape that did not receive the same damage that the European landscape did.
I like that, because it's almost an infiltration of, or sort of a bringing home of the realities of war. And that's the one thing that pops significantly in the literature. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is a great example of this. The main character, Clarissa Dalloway's having a party. She's in central London. But there's a secondary character who suffers from PTSD, Septimus Ward Smith. And spoiler alert, he kills himself, and the news of his death comes to Mrs. Dalloway's party. But even in a moment like that, you can see the ways in which there really is no separation. There is no getting away from kind of the realities of the war. And so I like the approach that you're suggesting, because it hints at that, right? That as much as we want to distance ourselves from it, you can't, right? And not only can we not, we should not. That it provides the most productive conversations when those realities are brought into stark contrast of, again, a party trope or something like that.
One other thing I would just quickly say about that is that, well, I think there's no question that the mechanization of the war leads to destruction on a level that is hard for us even now to fathom. Hopefully we're all somewhat aware of some of the stories from the battlefield of World War I, where you're thinking of sort of 19th century armies and 19th century generals suddenly fighting against massive naval guns that are firing shells that are 1,500 pounds, miles at a time. They're firing millions of shells at a time at the beginning of a bombardment before a battle. Battles that last for 10 months instead of in the 19th century a battle that might last for an afternoon. But that if we look at the beginning of the war, a lot of people are pretty excited about the mechanization that is going to lead us into this modern era of warfare. Here we have a German poster, which is "We forge the weapons for our fighting troops." And I know it's hard to see, but in the foreground, these are two blacksmiths, so showing this kind of traditional type of technology. But the landscape is full of factories. These are all smokestacks from factories. You can see the lights burning in the factories. The sky is filling with smoke. Similarly, this American poster, we provide the sinews of the war, and we see airplanes, and we see these modern battleships that are being built, and we have this feeling of the smokiness in the air. So there's a great sort of celebration of the potential of this energy that we're going to unleash in the war. But at the same time that they're making posters like this, that a poster like this is happening in the United States, and we're saying, look, we need to build these big, beautiful, modern weapons that will help us win the war. Those big, beautiful, modern weapons are mowing down people by the hundreds of thousands daily. I mean, a loss of life like we've never seen before. So again, I think there's an avoidance and an acceptance going on in a lot of these kinds of visual culture images, at least.
So post-war, you do see a lot of literary texts playing with this. D.H. Lawrence is a great example. So he actually has a pre-war text, a really early 20th century text, Howard's End, that kind of ends with this kind of looming red plume, and they're on the countryside, kind of looking out at the city. And so that's an earlier text for Lawrence, but he has a post-war novel, Women in Love, that actually shows kind of the devastating effects of industry. His father was a coal miner, so he wasn't divorced from industry at all. He has a lot of those images. But his post-war novels are doing something very, very different with industry. It's linked to death, it's linked to destruction, in a way that in the pre-war novel, again, it's just kind of this looming threat. You see the consequences of that in his novels in the 20s.
I'm interested in, because I'm an historian, in sort of the implications, what happens more long term in some ways about this. And it's not hard to see echoes of budding environmental movements in some of these texts and some of these literature texts, these pieces of art. In particular, it seems to me something like Henri Barbux's Under Fire, where you see it's a novel not unlike All Quiet on the Western Front. It's about pacifism, right? Environmentalism isn't really a thing in the 20s or 30s, but you see, in a sense, nature reclaiming itself. It's sort of like all of this industrialization, all this mechanization is just for nothing, because we're all going to end up in mud and more mud and more mud over and over again. And I feel like some of the imagery that's used, like people describing their experience in the First World War, is then picked up on later after World War II in describing when sort of this disenchantment with the world happened, right? And how we need to somehow get back, almost this romantic impulse of returning to nature. Takes a long time to get going, but eventually I think some of this, like these images of the smokestacks, eventually acquire a very negative connotation.
Yeah.
Right, and throughout the Western world.
Yeah.
I like that you're giving an agentic capacity to nature, though, because there is a sense in which the land does recover. There are all kinds of operations in England still to this day where, material from the Great War continues to be unearthed.
Yeah.
It's a very literal kind of bubbling up of material. And there's kind of a collection, and they send it off to be archived and whatever. But there is a sense that nature kind of writes back to the war, right? Kind of like tells its own story, and it's continuing to do that.
Do you think that I get the sense too in reading authors, literature from the era of the First World War, that there's an apocalyptic nature, right? This millenarian impulse going on. Do you think that nature is seen as the bringer of the apocalypse?
What is the bringer of the apocalypse? I think this is the better question. For D.H. Lawrence, I've already talked about it. For him, this mechanization gives rise to women in the workforce, and suddenly you have women who are working in these arms and ammunition factories because there were no able-bodied men. So for somebody who's kind of problematic and misogynistic like D.H. Lawrence, women usher in the apocalypse. He actually has a text called The Apocalypse, where women gaining freedoms, and shortly after this, women will gain the right to vote. Is apocalyptic for him. But I think in a broader sense, there was a very real kind of consideration for where do we go from here? How can we go on from here? Is it possible to go on? I think that exists.
It's making me think of, I'll refer to the film of All Quiet on the Western Front because I've seen the film more recently than I've read the book. The film has such a feeling of kind of, it's purgatorial, I might say, even more than apocalyptic for me, that there's this feeling of we're kind of stuck here, and once we get here, we can't go back or forward, right? I mean, the scenes where Paul, the main character, goes home and visits his family and then leaves early to go back to the front. Even though the entire film up to this point has been showing all of these devastating, horrifying things that he and his friends are experiencing, and most of his friends are dead by that point, but he's no longer comfortable with his family. This is no longer a place for him. And so he returns to the front, almost like he's, like you say, well, where do we go from here? I can't go back home. I'm a changed person, and I'm stuck in this process. And that experience that he has, I mean, I think All Quiet on the Western Front is a film, if you guys haven't seen it recently,
Read the book.
Read the book too, yes. If you haven't read it recently, read the book. If you haven't seen it recently, watch the film too. Shocking, for a 1930 film, shocking in its ability to still affect viewers. And the horrifying juxtapositions of blasted natural landscapes, broken trees and craters and earth, kind of spewing forth bodies. It's unbelievable what they accomplished in a film even from the 1930s. But I think that it gets back to these same issues of how our mechanized modern style of warfare is creating a new physical landscape, but in that new physical landscape, there are these very deep sort of spiritual and cosmological ramifications where we as humans are changing, and we're not sure what we're changing into yet, and we're not sure how to move forward, and we know we can't go back. So there's this feeling of being trapped within that space.
I'm just going to follow up quickly with another kind of brief anecdote from Joseph Conrad. Because one of the things I think he's most interested in, again, getting to this idea of the apocalypse or just fear in general, I think he recognized that, I think his fear was that there may not be an off button. And I think he was prophetic. I think he was recognizing the kind of fear that we kind of live with every day. Not to get too political, but it's this sense of, fear that we register when you sit down in a movie theater, or you board an airplane, or you go to a country music concert, or when you even sit in a classroom. Again, just that we may have, the war may have turned on something that we may not be able to turn off. And I think for Conrad, that was his variation of kind of the apocalypse. And I think it was highly prophetic. I think we're living with kind of the 21st century version of that.
I want to connect this with what Ken was talking about. We can't go back with what you were saying about women a minute ago. When you talk about women, and specifically you think of World War I. I mean, we don't often, as Americans at least, in popular culture, we think of Rosie the Riveter, World War II, and the changing World War I. That's sort of the watershed moment. But I'm not so sure. You think about women's life in Europe during World War I, that changed drastically. Not only were they required to work in munitions factories and do things they were not previously expected to do, at least for decades and decades, since industrialization, really. But you have women playing soccer, and getting huge crowds go watch them. You have a different sense of a home front when all the men, so many young men are gone and never come back. In respect to not just to work in factories, but to now they're the breadwinner. There's not enough men to marry. Is this, I guess what I want to ask, is this a watershed moment, a turning point for women's rights in the 20th century that we often overlook? Or is this kind of a dead end?
It's not a dead end. What you see more explicitly, I think, is women having greater access to sexuality. Right, so the sort of the untold story of the war are the female ambulance drivers, the women ambulance drivers who were volunteering in many cases as
who wouldn't receive rank.
Yeah, exactly,
the
exactly.
A male counterpart would for doing the same thing.
But Morgan, are you here? Helen Zena Smith. No, Morgan just wrote on this for me. Rewrites All Quiet on the Western Front from a women's perspective, from the perspective of female ambulance drivers, and. It is jarring in its language, it's jarring in its imagery, but what stands out to me the most every time I teach it is what these women were exposed to. So not just the trauma of war wounds, which they were required to tend and get these horribly maimed soldiers to hospitals or the closest spot that they could to get some care. They were also exposed to kind of the good old boys culture that existed with these soldiers. And there was a lot of sexuality, and there was a lot of crassness. And remember, in some cases, these are prim and proper Victorian young ladies who are now suddenly thrust into a very dark, highly sort of energized war scene. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that wars in general give rise to sort of a hypersexuality. But the problem is, as you were saying with All Quiet on the Western Front, right, the characters go home and they can't connect with anybody because nobody understands the realities of war, so they'd rather be back with their cronies in the trench. The women went home and were expected to be, again, these dainty Victorian women. And there's no going back from some of the experiences. Stepdaughters of War deals with kind of a seedy abortion that comes out of one of the characters' time, on the front as an ambulance driver. So the short answer to your question is there was not a pause. I think that this war effort gave women a very real place. It gave women with maybe more alternative sexualities a place to express that, because they could be part of an effort that kind of aligned themselves with what was deemed more masculine traits, right? So they would shave their heads and they would sign up to be an ambulance driver in France or whatever it is. We've not gone back. I think it was absolutely a watershed moment.
I think, and I'd like to show you another poster actually while we're talking about this, another couple posters if I may really quickly. I think there's no question that the war at least tacitly acknowledges a growing agency that women have been fighting for a long time. And at least from an American perspective, utilized some of the kind of organization that already existed as women had been fighting for the right to vote and other things, although they didn't have it yet. There was an existing kind of organization, social organization of women who were looking for new opportunities. And one of the things I think is interesting in looking at the posters from all of the countries is that you see a lot of posters targeting women specifically. So there's an acknowledgement of the fact from all of the nations involved that we need women to participate. Now, it was a gendered participation, so it was an acknowledgement of, okay, we need you, but we're not sure yet what we need you to do or exactly what that means. This is a German poster that was asking women to donate their hair. Their hair was woven into belts for machinery and transmissions for vehicles. But we see a lot of American posters that are targeting women, that are asking women to buy war bonds, to participate in food drives, whatever. One poster we have up at the museum that I didn't bring in shows Joan of Arc, so it shows a woman in full kind of chivalry battle armor with her sword raised, and it says Joan of Arc saved France. Now it's up to you, women of America, to save the country, but of course they want you to save the country by buying war stamps, not by picking up a sword and actually fighting, even though women actually could enlist in the service in World War I in the United States. Because of the Secretary of the Navy reading a particular naval act that had gender ambiguous language, he allowed women to actually sign up and serve in the military. So we do actually have women serving to some extent in the military to a limited extent. But I think you see these really fascinating ways that countries were trying to say, how can we use women? We see them as somehow powerful. But then we also see some images like this. Very famous poster, a Christie girl, Howard Chandler Christie is the artist who makes these, of a woman in a naval uniform, but she's not going to fight, she's trying to seduce men. So she's saying, I want you to join the Navy. So it's again this kind of, everyone's admitting, okay, we need women to do something, but a lot of it is, well, we want you to stay in your place and work where you are, rather than we want to actually acknowledge the powerful force you are.
So I like this image because I was talking earlier about the ways in which the war kind of infiltrated all aspects of life, right? And one of those aspects is fashion.
Yeah.
So you said he's wearing a naval officer's uniform, and I see it, and it's clearly a trench coat.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't realize that our modern trench coat came out of the trenches.
Yeah.
It came out of the trenches of World War I. And there are fascinating studies on the way that the trench coat kind of evolves into more popular clothing, and it was used by women to, as you mentioned, kind of seduce soldiers, but also to kind of just make the war experience maybe a bit more ubiquitous. So that it was just like this drab, camel-colored trench coat all over preceding the war, in part because resources were scarce and secondhand shops were plenty. But there's some interesting politics in terms of clothing, women and clothing, especially the trench coat.
Yeah. Let me switch gears now. We've been talking about the context of the war, why the war matters in the early 20th century broadly. We've talked a little bit about how it continues after that, but World War I ended almost 100 years ago now. I don't know that we know very people alive anymore who remember it. Why does it matter to us? We're talking about the legacy of the war after all. Is the legacy still a matter, or is this just an academic conversation?
I think we have to pause to remember. I think that there's something valuable in commemoration on one hand and celebration on the other. But I think it's our duty. That's a huge war word. Conrad uses it a lot. But I do think it's our duty to pause and remember, even if we do nothing more than that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's largely true that when we've been saying that there's this feeling that once you get to this place of the war, you never go back. I think that's true. And I think that we can trace a lot of who we are as a culture, as a society, as a people, to things that happened in World War I. Here's another poster. This is J.C. Leyendecker. I think World War I, just from kind of an American visual rhetoric perspective, is the beginning of this. I mean, this is a World War I poster. It's up at the museum. But when we think about what we think of now as kind of the really strong visual iconography of American patriotism, we can largely trace it back to World War I. If we're talking about things like Uncle Sam existed before that, but the iconography that we think of as Uncle Sam. When we think about the mass production and mass distribution of highly charged political rhetoric used for all sorts of things, not just used to encourage people to buy war bonds and to sign up, but nowadays used for things like to buy a Ford truck in the red, white, and blue event, right? Why is buying a Ford truck patriotic besides the fact that it's an American-made automobile? It's patriotic because if they make it patriotic, then they can stir emotions in you that make you want to buy a car. So the close tying of American propaganda and of trying to convince people to participate in the war effort with the emergence of what we see now as a modern mass media advertising industry, those two things grow up together. If you look at advertisements before the war, they're very wordy, lots and lots of text. The images aren't as important. By the time we get through the war, we get really powerful, bold images like this with simpler slogans, which is still the way advertising exists today. A lot of the people who are making posters like this for the war were working in advertising agencies in New York City, and through the war and producing thousands and thousands of posters. America, last major power into the war, right? We produced more posters than every other country combined. We printed 20 million posters in a year and a half. And maybe like over 1,000, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 different varieties of posters in a year and a half. So think about how frequently we were posting a new making a new poster. And so those people who made those posters, that's where they really learned how to do this. That's where they really learned how to manipulate emotions, manipulate psychology. And so I think the world we're living in from a consumer perspective, from an advertising perspective, from a mass media perspective, it starts in World War I.
So the perspective he left off is the political perspective.
Yes.
And I'm probably gonna like lose my job, but anyway, here I go. Because
There's no one listening.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no one can hear you.
I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that our current culture of fake news began with World War I. There was a tremendous effort, especially in Britain, by the War Propaganda Bureau. They recruited some of the best literary talent to write propaganda pieces. Conrad was part of it, Kipling was part of it, Bennett was part of it, Hardy was part of it. I mean, the list is enormous. And I think it's important to recognize where we are in our current moment, but also to understand how we got here.
Yeah.
And I think that the war kind of gave rise to, as I said, Conrad would call it war talk, Trump would call it fake news, right? I don't think we're far removed.
I agree. And sorry, just one more thing in line with that. When you look at a system of politics today in the United States, where if somebody lies, if a politician lies, instead of correcting that, they just say the same lie over and over, and eventually people believe that it's true. One of the things they did in World War I that the propaganda agencies did, including the CPI in the United States, the Committee on Public Information, was flood the media with news releases. They would release 600 news releases in a day. Just as much information as they could possibly pour upon you. And then how are you supposed to define where the truth and where the lies are when you have to go through 600 press releases? And how are we supposed to know where is the truth and where is the lie when we have people tweeting 30 times a day? So I think you're absolutely right. The political world we live in today is a continuation of what we experienced in.
But I think it's not just the hyper, the mediatic world. I think it's absolutely true that the modern mediatic world begins really with World War I. It's unleashing things that are already happening. We already have the technology for this kind of newspapers.
But they're mobilized.
We're mobilizing it. But I think that even more broadly, maybe less sharply political in today's terms, the way that the world thinks of politics today, the way that liberal democracies are set up, I think really begins with World War I, where this older aristocratic order is overthrown, is toppled, and really doesn't survive. And after that, the world tries to find its footing, and in some ways that leads to World War II, right? It continues. The legacy of World War I in part is World War II, and everything that comes after it. You can't really separate the two.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, I think that's probably about the end of our conversation naturally, so.
Yeah, that ended up well, yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah,
That's
people
the
want to come and
question.
ask questions, there's a microphone over here.
If nobody else is getting up, I'll prime the pump on Rob McFarland. Do you want to talk about peace or pop culture? Good choice.
Pop culture.
Okay. Why are we refighting World War I now? Why is Wonder Woman in World War I?
Yeah.
Why is Berlin
Yeah,
Babylon
yeah.
in World War I? Why is the Winter Soldier? All this. Why are our and of course with archaic weapons there with swords and shields, not
right.
with the weaponry that we associate with World War I.
Yeah, I mean, how far is this from Wonder Woman,
No,
right?
it is Wonder
And a
Woman.
different outfit, but Wonder Woman
Yeah.
traditionally wears red, white, and blue, right? I mean, this is pretty close.
Right, we have a Captain America and Captain Ameriquette.
Yeah.
And they're why World War I now? World War II is in Harry Potter, but this is with Grindelwald and whatever. But this is a pop cultural moment for it. Is the centenary, or is there something else that's wrong?
I have one answer,
Great.
which I don't think is very satisfying, but I think needs to be said before we get to other answers that are probably more meaningful. And that is that World War I is safer now. If you look at what Jan Osman talks about with collective memory, he distinguishes between collective memories that we all remember because we have relatives. For example, your grandparents remember it. And those last, he claims, 70, 80, maybe 90 years. And then they fade and become cultural memory. So we have a cultural memory of the American Revolution or of the Civil War, right? World War I is passing into cultural memory right now by that estimation. And I think beyond that, World War II is so ideological, so charged that way that we almost carry it into our current politics and fights and arguments now. So it's safer. But I don't think that fully answers the question either, because why World War I and not some other war, right?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is this, that World War II, is we've done it so much. I mean, think of how many World War II movies exist compared to how many great World War I movies have been made in the United States. So it's maybe the movie industry sees it as fertile ground that hasn't been utilized as much. Maybe the centenary does bring it to people's attention. I think it's more malleable, as you're saying, sort of passing into almost into a mythic space for us. And where World War II, we have a very clearly defined idea of who the players were in World War II, speaking from an American cultural perspective, of who wears the white hats and who wears the black hats and why we were there, and we were there for a righteous cause. Those issues are not as commonly understood by the general American public. If you ask the regular American walking down the street, who were the major players in World War II? Who were the major political leaders in World War II? Why were we fighting in that war? Those questions would be harder to answer. So maybe it's easier to tell narratives in that space because the World War II narratives are so locked in. I don't know, maybe that's one thing. But I think there's probably a lot more to it than that. We may not know for another 20 or 30 years.
I don't have an answer. I don't know. But I've noticed it, and I'm grateful for it. Simply because I exist in this weird sphere where I tell people that I study World War I literature, and they constantly say, have you read all the light we cannot see? It's a world, it's the World War II, like quasi-text.
Yeah.
And I'll just echo the sentiment here. I think World War I is so far removed from our cultural understanding, especially on the American front, that I've been kind of thrilled to see it represented in the ways that you've suggested, but I don't have an answer. The centenary would probably be my best guess, and just exposure. But
It's a difficult, complicated question.
Yeah.
Should we have another one? Yeah.
My name is Brendan. I study Russian. What I have probably isn't like a question per se, but it does add, I think, to what Professor McFarland was saying, what we were talking about, current implications of World War I and the literature surrounding World War I and things like that. There is a myriad of modern shows on Netflix. We talked about movies as well that have been made within the last few years, Babylon Berlin, even Peaky Blinders, which touches on a lot of, my interest in World War I has always been like the shift from like this romantic fight for God and country to this mechanized meat grinder that was World War I. And I hadn't really given too much attention to the rise of feminism and suffrage and things like that. And those themes are touched on so heavily in these shows, in a way that we also talked about how today it's so hard to understand what's true and what's right with so much information. And I think a lot of current filmmakers, writers are once again drawing upon this specific instance of history to create a form of fiction that can express and explore those themes in a way that is palatable, because issues of feminism obviously are still so very important.
So can I address this question in tandem with Rob's? Because I think what we're seeing is a desire for new representations of the war. So you've talked about kind of the women's perspective. But there's so much work to be done on the colonial perspective, right? I mean, the colonial soldiers, the black soldiers, disability studies, animal studies, the photography of the war. I just for so long we've had a central narrative, and that narrative has largely been Eurocentric. And there's a pretty big push, at least in literary circles right now, to move beyond that, to start accounting for different voices, different perspectives, the Middle East perspective, the Asian perspective, the New Zealand perspective. So again, and that's just sort of geographical. That doesn't get into anything, just again in terms of gender or cultural studies. So Rob, that may be the answer to your question. That maybe we're just trying to expand that narrative, and by tapping into some of the programs that both of you have mentioned, it may be a way of accessing that conversation and extending that conversation beyond a Eurocentric sphere.
My name is Bailey Newsink. I'm studying environmental science, but my great-grandfather was a nurse in World War I. And I feel like the perspective we see of nurses is women volunteering, like Vera Brittain, for instance. And I just was wondering, is there a reason why we haven't seen the view of a male nurse? Like, do you have an opinion about that? Or maybe was there not as many? All I know is that my great-grandfather was, but maybe not necessarily that there was.
For which country was he a nurse?
He, from the US, but he had emigrated from the Netherlands.
Okay.
Wow. That's a great story. I mean, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is simply that we probably still have, even though we're trying to disrupt some of these things and look for new narratives and new perspectives, we probably still have more of a thirst for the masculine story of the war, which is glorified through images of soldiers holding rifles, of doughboys in trenches. And I think that my initial reaction is that I think a lot of audiences would have a hard time appreciating the story of a heroic male nurse. I think they would read nursing as a gendered profession, as wrong as that is, to necessarily push it into that place. Even though, I mean, historically, obviously we don't have to get into that whole thing. But I think that that's my initial reaction. I think that maybe audiences previously haven't had a desire to see that kind of story. It sounds fascinating, though. I think it would be wonderful to have a more open and expanded perspective of seeing all of these kind of micro-narratives that emerge from something as complicated as the war.
My question as an historian, and I don't have an answer to this, by the way, is whether or not we've had that perception of nursing being specifically, almost resolutely, a women's profession since 1914 or 1918 or whatever, or whether there's a moment during World War I or afterwards where
It becomes more.
where a male nurse is not fantastic or weird, but then we go back to it. I don't know much about the representation of nurses and how that may change over time. But my guess is that it's just like he said, it's so resolutely feminine that did he call himself a nurse at the time, or is that how he describes it later? I guess that's another question, right? Yeah, I don't know. Other questions?
I'm Nick Mason from the English department. I've been kind of on a World War I kick the last couple of years. Also, I'm a partisan in ways to the approach, but I also find myself skeptical in ways about some of the claims. I think we all tend to, those of us who study the past all tend to want to make year zero claims for whatever it is we studied. You know, modernity begins, well, if you're talking to a medievalist, 1350, right? Maybe I push back a little bit on this. I'll pick on you, Stewart. Just as a historian, you know, when you make the claim that in ways modern structures come into play with the toppling of governments and so forth, I mean, how was World War I fundamentally different than 1789, French Revolution, or 1688, the Glorious Revolution in England?
I think it's a fair question, right? I mean, in part because the topic of this panel is legacy of the Great War, and you want it to seem important. You don't want some esoteric, out of the way thing. I think that World War I. I think that Jarica was actually right in emphasizing that there's a lot more continuity than we used to think. Historians these days like to find ways to do exactly what Nick is doing, to find ways to blow up the seminal, pivotal moments, right? 1945 is the break, the Stunde Null, the 0 hour. Well, that's been said for so many decades, it's getting tiresome. So we want to find continuities. And I think the same is probably true of World War I as well, that there are lots of continuities, for example, in the style of writing, like Modernism and what it was. You know, the war obviously changed it because it's a big event, but it didn't necessarily create the new structure. I think that politically, while it didn't necessarily, I mean, there are some ways in which we could talk about World War I being, we'll say, the catalyst, maybe not the originator, but a catalyst for new political structures, like the Russian Revolution as a result, in some ways, of World War I, or fundamental changes in the way that the German government operates. The Weimar Republic is very, very different from whatever kind of democracy existed before in Germany, right? The formation of new states in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, all of which are flawed, all of which are problematic, but as messy and as flawed as they are, they're also new. So it's kind of an either or. I mean, it's kind of both at the same time, I guess. Does either of you want to respond to?
I think my earlier response answered it. I totally agree with you, Nick. I don't see it as a rupture. I see it as a continuity.
Hi, thanks so much. This is Sterling, and the overflow outside is growing, so good turnout. I study transitional justice, and I'm really interested in the rise of two phenomena. So we have this new growing Global Memory Studies Association. It's now, I think, in its 4th year, which is kind of exciting. And then also intersectionality. That started through Black female literature, right, being disenfranchised within legislation and law enforcement. But now intersectionality is weaving throughout many different areas. Where would you like to see overlap, and perhaps in what direction would you like this new Global Memory Studies Association to take itself?
Wow, that's a good question. I hear intersectionality, I look to the literature. Maybe I should have.
Yeah.
Any intersectional memories you'd like to see?
I'd have to think about it. So, I mean, does memory studies mean what I think it actually means? Like, just the ways in which we remember events? Is that how we're defining this?
Partly post-conflict, partly not.
Right. This is just my own hobby horse, so I'll throw it out there. I would love to see more done with photography. The photography of the war, how it tells stories, how it aids in remembrance. There's quite a bit of work that's been done on memorialization, the way that we memorialize the war in museums and things like that. But there are a number of photographs that were just taken by soldiers, by civilians, and as someone who's interested in narrative, I'm interested in the storytelling of those images. And again, I realize it's not exactly memory studies, but I do think it has an effect in the way that we remember and the way that we rely on images to help us remember. That's a hobby horse, and I've not gotten there yet, but I own a couple of original World War I prints, just photographs, and they're very compelling to me in the stories that they tell.
It's interesting to think about memory. That's more difficult to answer because I don't create these memories, right? But as an historian, it's been fascinating to see, and this is not necessarily new, the turn towards looking at Germany's imperial empire before World War I, sort of the years leading up to the war, maybe including it as well, coming into focus, being studied much more carefully, looking at the actual peoples who lived there, not just as an extension of the metropole, but the people of color who are actually in these far-flung, now somewhat forgotten German colonies. And I cannot think of very many studies about the women who live in those colonies and their experience. There probably are some. I think that would be really interesting. Maybe not just in the German sense, because that's what I study is Germany, but in the French and British colonies as well. How did women in these colonies, how were they affected by the war? What did it mean when men from certain colonies like Senegal went to go fight to them? How did that change their society and culture? I mean, I guess that's more history, but I'd be interested in both history and memory representations of that. Sure.
Thank you.
Cameron McCoy, History Department. I wanted to comment a little bit on, what's your name again? On Rob's comment about how you look at pop culture, and then I do have a question about the political nature of the war. So first, I think one thing that's so attractive about World War I is this innocence for the United States. So you're looking at a nation that seems somewhat innocent, but it has very, very deep inroads to neutrality. And the one thing is that people typically look at the war as, well, the United States was dragged in through this attack. Spanish-American War, USS Maine, United States dragged into this fight. And I think for the political angle that I look at, I wanted to just end on the pop culture piece about just, there's this incredible innocence that comes with World War I, because we do see that these ideological lines fade very, very quickly with regard to gender, to race, and even to memorization. It's not memorization, but memory. And so with the political angle, I was very curious to understand how the three of you evaluate, or if you do, Wilson as a figure saying, I'm going to keep you out of the war, and that quickly changes to a world safe for democracy. And then also, while I don't like to connect World War I and World War II very neatly or seamlessly, then the same thing happens with the United States in 1941, where this platform of isolationism, and then again, the United States is attacked. There's this violent event that seems to create a blossom of patriotism. And so I was very curious as to how you look at those two things side by side when you look at these political figures.
Yeah. But Kenneth should answer this one first.
Well, I mean, obviously it's a very complicated question, especially thinking of the figure of Wilson, who is, I think, so inscrutable to so many people as we look back. The great debate about whether or not he really was truly deeply convicted about neutrality, or whether he had a very convincing mask that he wore, and that was all in service ultimately of moving away from this notion of American neutrality. But I think, as you mentioned, there is a long-standing precedent for American neutrality that so many politicians and Americans could point to, going back to George Washington if they want to. And so I think there's no question that that is a long-standing doctrine within American history. That doesn't mean that we necessarily really believe it or act as though we believe it. But I think there's no question that there's continuously political lip service paid to the notion that America should not be involved in these types of things until we get to World War I. Whether or not I think Wilson really, truly, if we could take it at face value, that he really did want to stay out of the war, and that he was proud of keeping the nation out of the war until things forced his hand. I think I probably fall down a little bit more on that side, that I think he probably did really truly believe that he was trying to keep America out of the war. I'll accept that as maybe being true based upon what I've seen, but I wouldn't say I'm convinced of that. But I would say that what you're pointing out, though, is hopefully what all of us would hope for, which is a more complicated and nuanced reading of all of the players, of all of the political situations that lead to this kind of conflict, and understanding that none of these things are monolithic or unilateral, that we're dealing with very complicated, braided, textured meanings, and that it's really difficult to say what is true or what is real or what did this person believe or why did they do the things they did. I don't know if we can ever recover that, but I think that you're right to say that we should question those motives and those situations and use that more nuanced approach to the way that we understand and analyze and write history.
Yeah, I'll let that stand.
Yeah,
All right, yes. Please join me in thanking our guests for this smart and stimulating discussion.